Welcome to the ONEder Podcast. This is your host, CCB, and our conversation today is one in a series of three conversations that we're having with our 2024 ONEder Grant award-winning teams. Just a little information or background on the ONEder Grant. It is a program started by One Workplace in 2019 to empower architects and designers to explore the impact of design on human behavior and the environment. And since 2019, we've given out 24 ONEder Grants, which have gone across the spectrum and in looking at new and evolving research. And when I say across the spectrum, what that helped us understand was maybe we should tighten it up a little bit and ask people to all submit proposals around a particular theme. And so last year's theme was embracing change. And the nature of that was helping us all understand perhaps new ways of navigating the dynamic transformations that are taking place in any of the environments that we're working in. Today's ONEder Grant team is from Perkins Eastman, and they did this most interesting, you're going to love it, study called Someplace Like Home. Leveraging the science of hominess at work. Okay, first off, you got to love hominess as a word that's being used. And then second off, I'm going to say welcome to Widya and Katie from Perkins Eastman. And I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves first. Widya, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. My name is Widya. I'm a design researcher at Perkins Eastman. My background is in architecture and human factors. I have a PhD in architecture. My research interest has been around the intersection of architecture and health. So how the built environment impact occupants' health, including like their physical, mental, cognitive health across building types and life stages.
Wow.
So nice to meet you.
Nice. Thank you so much. And Katie?
Hi, CCB. Thank you so much for having me. I'm also a design strategist at Perkins Eastman. My background's in architecture, but I'm very interested in understanding the relationship between people and space and how the built environment influences the way people think and behave and feel in a space. Over the last few years, especially, I've been heavily invested in our research for workplace, and also just very interested in how to connect research to practice and turning those insights into things that we can really use as architects and designers.
No, I was going to say, wait a minute.
Perkins Eastman.
I'm hoping that you'll share, a little bit more about Perkins Eastman.
Thank you. So Perkins Eastman is a large global firm. We have 24 studios around the world, and we do all kinds of things from architecture, interior design, planning, and strategic consulting services. That includes a lot of practice areas from workplace and healthcare to hospitality and large-scale planning. But Widya and I are part of a human-centered consulting group within the firm that brings together a group of people with really diverse backgrounds. We have backgrounds in business and neuroscience and environment behavior research, and design, and we're focused on solving problems from a human-centered perspective.
Okay, I'm just going to say I'm really jealous and I kind of want to come work for your team, but because I can't, I will now say that to all of our listeners, for all of the ONEder Grants, there is a page that's dedicated to the research that each one of the teams has done. So as we're talking through here, you will be able to reference back and download information and access a lot of the tools that Widya and Katie are going to mention. And you're going to be really wanting to do that, especially after you listen to what's going on here. I am going to ask the question, you're kind of addressing, with your interest, what the inspiration might have been behind the research, but I'd love for you to kind of, what sparked the interest in hominess? This is a two-part question. What sparked the interest in hominess, and how are you defining hominess?
I'll take that question. Thank you. So the reason we chose this topic is because of our firsthand experience in corporate interiors and with our workplace clients, especially over the past several years. we've seen so many clients who are changing the way that they're working. They want to make a difference in their offices. They're introducing flexibility and maybe hybrid work. And so as we're navigating those changes with them, we're noticing that the office itself, the role of the office, is not what it used to be before the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, the office was a place where people just expected to come every day. It was assumed that that's where you would get your work done. And those expectations changed so much during the pandemic. Things are swinging back a little bit now, but the role of the office has really become more collaborative. You need to have a reason to be there. You're meeting with people. It's a place for mentorship and culture building. And with all of these changes in the workplace, we're really interested in how the physical environment should respond to these new ways that people are working. So when it comes to hominess, what we've noticed is that people are losing their home base at work. And this is for a few reasons. One is the prevalence of unassigned seating, where you're seeing hot desking or free address or hoteling. But what that means is that there's not a one-to-one ratio of desks to people anymore. So you're not coming into the same seat every day. Another trend that has been on our radar for a while is the open plan seating, which is pretty polarizing. And when you put these two things together, you have this perfect storm of, people sitting in open spaces, feeling exposed. Maybe they're, distractions. They're hearing people, seeing things, and they also, don't feel like they have ownership of their own space. So we wanted to understand what that is doing to people. What does it mean when people are losing their sense of a home base at work? And to answer your first question, the way that we define hominess is just the quality of space that makes you feel at home. So it's about physical and psychological comfort. Feeling at home in a space can reduce cognitive load or like the mental effort that you're putting into scanning your environment and figuring out how you're going to interact with it. And when you feel at home, the space is familiar, you know what to expect. Your brain just doesn't have to work as hard to interpret and process, and you have more bandwidth to be creative and, focus and do all of those important things for knowledge workers.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here and say, on our website, there will be on the Perkins Eastman page a link to the website that they've created to help put the context around this work. And it is so well done. I cannot applaud your entire team enough for building something that's so cohesive, explanatory, fun, and engaging. And it tells the story so well. So knowing that people can go and find that, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that research approach. How did you get at the meat of what it was you were trying to uncover?
Yeah, so I can take that question. So the big question that we have for this research is, first, we have a conceptualization of what hominess is. The first thing that we are trying to understand is like, what are the barriers to hominess when you're working in a free address open plan environments? So this part, really understanding what are the challenges, what hinders the feeling of hominess in one's workplace. And then the second one is, after we know all these challenges, how can behavior design enhance hominess in a free address open plan environment? So it started a very simple, big question. And then to answer this, we structure this study into a mixed method study. So we're using 4 main methods. The first one is a survey. We've done this survey before in our previous part of the study, and then we're enlarging the survey and focusing it more into hominess. So on the survey, we survey about 477 knowledge workers to understand how important is the feeling of hominess for them in a work setting? And then after understanding how important it is what environmental elements that people associate with hominess. So we get that information as a starting point from the survey. And then going to the second step is observation. So we have two of our colleagues. We haven't mentioned that we also work with Rebecca Milne, who is also the Associate Principal of Design Strategy at Perkins Eastman. We work with Dr. Hannah Negami, whose background is in neuroscience, also working in the previous ONEder Grant research about creativity in workplace. We have Charlotte, whose background is industrial design, and we have Bob Condia, who is a professor emeritus at Kansas State University. So working with this diverse group of people, we surveyed. So there's a quantitative part of the study, and then we look at the observation, looking at the behavior of people in 4 different type of workplace. So the first one is a technology company, and then we also do observation at an architecture firm, a co-working cafe, and also a public library. So it's really giving a wide range of workplace settings that are open space and free address. In these observations, the goal is really to understand the relationships between the space and what people do in the space, and in what way it supports or hinders their feeling of hominess. So this is the qualitative part of this research. After that observation, we also have a sample of volunteered employees who are working in these type of environments that we observe. We call it a user experience diary. So they share to us about their workplace experience for different number of days. They can give us like artifacts. It could be like just jot down notes or a video or photos. So instead of us looking at what they're doing, this is really they sharing their experience firsthand to us. So really enrich the type of data that we get. So that's 3. And then the last one is that we conducted workshop with industrial design students. This is really the last part after we analyze all other things. So we shared our initial findings and kind of like do an idea generation and validation with the students to bring forward this research in terms of like developing ideas, products that can leverage hominess in a workplace environment.
Oh my gosh, I need to like take a little rest here and put a cold damp cloth on my forehead. That's so much work. And again, it is impressive the way that all of this information comes together and can be simplified and be valuable in use for the clients that you're working with to be able to understand and then parse out what's important. I also want to make a note here that, in you're talking about looking at the library or looking at the knowledge workers, when we look at this information, it may have been done for a workplace, but it certainly has broader impact across different types of environments, because you're talking about the human being, the human experience in the environment. So I think that's something that we should just make note of so that folks don't get too bogged down by, this is a workplace study. Interesting, all of those different tools or different tactics that you use to collect the information. What was the most surprising insight?
Yeah, so something that's surprising, it's what I really like about this research is that we're acknowledging from the very beginning that there is, good in the direction of like moving into open plans and free address environments, and there are also challenges, and that's exactly what we found here. We found like there's an inherent tensions in the experience of people who are working in a free address open plan environments. So 4 things. The first one, the tension between autonomy and conformity, right? Like the idea, you can choose the place that fits best to your needs and to your comfort. So that's great. We're giving autonomy to people. But at the end of the day, you're not the only one occupying that space, right? You're sharing that space with other people who are also, practicing their autonomy. So there is a sense of like a limit to one's autonomy in a public space, which is going to like the conformity. There are behavioral norms and there are guidelines in terms of like how loud can you speak, and like, you can't agree on a certain temperature. It's a free address model. Someone has to you got to set up the temperature in certain, position. So there are some things that are still need a collective sharing in that sense. So it's the tension between autonomy and conformity. So that's the first one that we found interesting. The second one is the freedom to choose. You can choose whenever you want. You can move as many times as you want in a day, right? With the many options available. But keep in mind that there is going to be a time cost to that. And it's not like you sit down to a new place and then you can head into productivity right away. There's some set of like comfort that you have to set up, right? The physical ergonomics, the cognitive ergonomics, technology. We love technologies, but there's sometimes it's also hindering us to work faster, right?
Katie can speak to that from this morning. But anyway, go ahead.
So there's a tension between the freedom to choose versus the time to settle after you're making that choice. The third one is collaboration versus privacy. I think this is pretty well researched out there about open plan environment. You don't have a lot of barriers. The idea is to encourage people to collaborate more, having more visual context and more connection. But there's also a tension to that because it creates disruptions to engage in more of a heads down focused sensitive work. And then the last thing is the idea of like temporality and identity. In a free address environment, yes, you can claim a place, a workstation for a certain time, but that time dependent nature really limits one's ability to further personalize their place, their workstation, in a way that reflects their identity. So there is going to be like a finding a sweet spot that it's not like a clean and like sterile environment that doesn't really sparse anyone's personality. But so you kind of find the middle ground between temporality versus identity in this type of space.
Katie, let me ask a question. Did you see, because you looked at those 4 different groups, did you find any significant differences in the way that the public library versus the, knowledge workers, in the way that they approach the creating comfort addressing the nature of behavioral norms, I think, is always fascinating. But I just wondered if anything looked markedly different in the way that you were.
Let me think about that. Weedia might be the best one to answer this question because she was closer to those.
Yeah. That's a good question. I honestly haven't thought about it. So when we get to the idea of like affordances, because after we identify the tensions, we're kind of going into like how do we create hominess, and one of the thing is sense of trust to the space. So it's not just to the space, but to the surrounding. And for the technical company and the architecture firm, this is regular people, right? They know they're kind of like part of a certain organization. So the sense of trust is very different than the sense of trust for people coming in a co-working space where like everybody can come in and in the library. So the idea of leaving towels on the beach, we found it in the co-working space and in the public library, right? Like they want that seat. And sometimes we're humans, we need to take bio breaks, we need to order the coffee, and like we got to look for the books, something like that. So they're using their personal belongings to claim the space. And like it's a very different where you are working in an office, right? You come in, you have your own kind of like locker, and then you just use that space. Once you logged in, like we just using that table, right? That computer is on, it's under someone's username. So there's like a sense of trust is very different in that type of environment because one, you have some kind of like regular, so you have a shared identity going to that space, and the other one is like really open to public, but you're trying to kind of like create your own space in a way and also declare it that you are there at the moment. And you don't want to leave kind of like your laptops and stuff in a space that you don't feel comfortable leaving.
I love the idea of towels on the beach. I'm going to carry that one forward. Okay, so you've got all this amazing research and you're looking at it, and ideally there's strategies that you're going to kind of pull together or land upon that might help create environments that feel more homey. So I think, Widya, you just kind of addressed that nature of trust, but there were four that you call out that I think are really, really spot on. So who wants to tell us about key strategies to create a workplace that feels like home?
I can take this one. So I think something that stands out to us is that in our research, we found that if we had to have, say, 4 pillars of hominess, would be looking at comfort, both physical and psychological comfort, familiarity, trust, which Widia talked about, and a sense of ownership. And it's almost like the condition of the modern office targets all 4 of those things. If you're in an open plan office environment and you don't have a seat of your own, all of the research says that can be a problem for creativity, being productive. If you feel like you're sitting in a space where you're being surveilled, you sense that you're being watched, that definitely chips away at your cognitive load. I think that open plan seating and unassigned seats are not going anywhere because they really are based in necessity, right? We're in the new way of working, people aren't expected to be necessarily in the office synchronously. Like they might be, a distributed team, and it just doesn't make sense to have, an allocation for every single employee, whether or not they're going to be there. But I think like where the problem is that, if you're making decisions based on assumptions, like if there are no walls in the office, then people will automatically talk to each other more. You have to actually find out if that's true because, now there's the Harvard study that shows that actually people collaborate face-to-face less when they're in an open plan office. And so I think that part of what the ONEder Grant has enabled us to do is just go a little bit deeper with this research and ask the questions and just kind of poke at, is this true? What does it mean? How can we make the experience better?
I have all my little notes that I was looking at. And then there was that 86% of respondents to your survey considered it important to feel at home. And the number one was physical comfort, which takes us back to a conversation that we started kind of earlier before we started recording, which was people are people first, and then they come into whatever the environment is. And I wonder, when you looked at the 4 kind of strategies or the pillars, how does that then translate into recommendations or suggestions or thoughts about how environments might evolve?
So comfort comes first, like that's physical comfort. But sometimes people limit it into like, oh yeah, ergonomics, chair and desk, right? No, it's like it's beyond. It's like psychological comfort. We also heard from our survey, the qualitative part of the survey, they're like, like being in a space where you like the community, you don't feel judged by the community. That's also comfort, right? So don't forget when we're trying to think about how do you create hominess, like should I include like this really warm lighting and like plants, like, yeah, that's great. Actually, that's one of the strategies that we mentioned under familiarity. But don't forget that architecture is part of a whole system. There is a social system and there's a cultural system. And making change in one thing, say making physical things in the built environment, should be, intentionally paired with some policy change and cultural change, because together that will help us closer to hominess. So that's one thing. I mentioned about familiarity. Familiarity is like the idea that you already feel like intimately know the space and physically and emotionally comfortable. I mentioned biophilia or innate connection with nature. Like some warm ambience through like lighting, texture. One thing that I love in one of this our finding is I mentioned earlier about like you can't really individually personalize the space, right? Because like somebody else might gonna use it the next day. But we found this in several of our site observation. There is a sense of shared personalization. Yes, you can't give individual personalization. You can't like put your family photo, wedding photos, kids photos in like your table. That's gonna be a lot of work. But there are the walls, there are the common areas, there's the lounge that you go and there you as human and your coworkers are collaborating and interacting. So you can kind of decide on how do you beautify and decorate this space and create something where you can contribute together. We found like a basketball hook. So it's like it's a playfulness in a space when people just got out of a very stressful meeting and just like throw some balls and like somebody would come in and join. So invest in displays and activities that encourage people to collectively personalize the space. So collective personalization, that's my favorite part. And then think about, our innate needs as human. We need eat, we need to take bio breaks, and we need to take a nap maybe. Provide convenience to take that micro breaks is also kind of important to the sense of familiarity in the space. So that's kind of like some examples that we found.
That's fantastic. Okay, now it makes me think of, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole at all, but one of last year's ONEder Grants was dealing with neuro-inclusivity, designing for inclusivity. And you're saying this without specifically saying this. There's an implicit suggestion that a wider variety of types of spaces and environments will be most supportive to the collective.
That's a great observation, actually, because when you're talking about inclusive design for neurodiversity, which we've done a little bit of research on ourselves, it's a much better approach to make sure you're providing variety and choice, because there's really no one environment that is going to be, suitable to everyone. And autonomy plays into that too. But in the same way, hominess is a very subjective experience, right? It's based on the things that are familiar to us personally, the preferences and the things that we associate with certain objects. Like it's just different. I remember one thing that's kind of funny. We talked before the podcast about like things that we should share among ourselves with the group. And Hannah on our team mentioned the show Severance. And I said to her, I couldn't get into it because the environment, the office environment is just so drab. It's kind of like life sucking. And Hannah said, I love the office environment in Severance. It's such a clean aesthetic and the chairs are so beautiful. And I thought that is a perfect example of just the subjective experience of a space, right? To me, I can't wait to get out of there or turn off the TV. And to someone else, it's like, the reason they watch the show.
It's fascinating because I have a whole host of questions that kind of get at what might recommendations be, but you're talking about them as we're sitting here having this conversation. You're talking about tools that organizations might consider, and they're not just about the space. Widya, to your point, there's policies, and there's how do you build culture, and so how do you recognize it or support it? To your point, Katie, what's the breadth of or the scope of how it needs to be inclusive, to embrace all the users? I wonder moving forward, Perkins Eastman has such a huge presence across the globe. Isn't that interesting? How might this look, if we move from a culture of, US workers to a culture that's not?
Me and Katie just had that conversation why it's important to think about the culture. So I was born and raised in Indonesia. We have a high power distance. So, just like referring to my boss, I can't just say names, right? It's very uncomfortable. Just take someone who work in Indonesia, like their whole life, move here, and then like just having a conversation with the CEO of a company and just like addressing the CEO by the first name, it's going to be like sweaty and like very uncomfortable. So imagine you're creating this like free address environment and open plan environment in those two settings, and give the same prompt, like you can do whatever you want here. And for in a culture where there is a short power distance, everyone feel they have the same agency to make interventions to the space, to change things, to add on displays, and to even share their ideas, starting different things and come up with cultures and whatnot. But in a country or in a culture with a high power distance, you're going to see that like the higher ups are likely to make changes, but not the people who are just starting, or like even the middle, the middle level, because there is a sense of like, can I do this? Like if there's no clear policy that, stating that, yes, you can, there's going to be two different behavior coming out and making changes in this environment.
That's a great observation and the nature of cultural agency. I remember working on a project with a Dutch firm that was a tech company here in the US, and we created mini cafes that had technology in them so that they could be work cafes as well. No one used them. That was just like, what? And there was a disconnect, obviously, in programming and having the conversation. And oh yeah, that sounded good, but literally, unless there was some explicit permission given, people felt like that looked like I wasn't working, and so they wouldn't take advantage of them. We're coming at the end of our time, so I'm so regretful that we cannot, have this conversation forever. But the idea of clarity in communications and explicit acceptance of terms, understanding what you're describing, and having agreement so that people can move forward you've done a great job in explaining them. And I think I'm going to also remind our listeners that you're going to be able to go to their website and see how very clearly and very comfortable and accessible the descriptions are. So, Lydia and Katie, we're at the end of our time. I'm so sorry. But if there's anything else that you wanted to share, one little nugget or reinforce something that we talked about, is there anything that you feel you'd like to give as parting words of wisdom?
I guess my thought in this research and most of the research we do is just that there's so much room to change and improve the experience of people using a space when you learn a little bit more about how to move the needle on that experience. Like a study like this has just changed the way that we think about free address and unassigned seating. And even like for myself personally, when I'm in my home office, I'm thinking about how to change the space around me to be more comfortable, like taking the time to adjust my task lamp or put up more pictures of my kids' drawings. So that's my thought. It's just lots of potential.
It's a nugget that you get to take away. Every single person gets to take away just kind of what is that permission that you give yourself. Interesting. Anything from you, Widya?
Yeah, for me, it's like from the designer perspective, have a conversation because everyone have a different sense of what makes them feel at home. And we shouldn't forget that feeling at home encounters like physical comfort, but also psychological comfort. So thinking holistically in that way, but also when we're coming up with strategy, thinking about architecture not or interior as an exclusive thing, but it goes hand in hand with, the policy changes and also the cultural changes, because at the end of the day, we're designing for human, and human is a very complex being that not just function as a physical being, but there's a social being as well. So yeah.
That's fantastic. All right. Thank you, Katie and Widya from Perkins Eastman. I'm going to remind us all that the ONEder Podcast is available on all streaming services. And remember, there are 2 more ONEder Grant podcasts that will be available. And listening to what each one of the teams has to offer this year relative to embracing change is fascinating, because there definitely are threads that continue through each one of the conversations. Again, to your point, Widya, because we're all human beings. Thank you so much. And I'm going to sign off from the ONEder Podcast. Bye-bye.